So in this video, we'll talk about something that we alluded to in the previous video, and that is this idea of reading actively. First and foremost, when we talk about reading actively, we want to keep in mind the importance of extracting the main idea. So as we're reading, we want to try to identify the central question, problem, or issue that the author is raising, and we don't want to get bogged down in details. And I know that can sometimes be tricky when you get into a passage that starts throwing out all kinds of technical terms and supporting details. We want to try to find a path through that to the main idea, and we'll talk more specifically about how to do that in a little bit. We want to question as we read. So, for example, you might ask yourself, how does this sentence relate to what I've already read? And that's something that you can apply pretty much to each sentence as you go. Again, you don't have to do it explicitly every time, but that's part of the process. Another question to ask would be, is this a factual claim or the author's opinion? And you can look to the way the sentence is phrased or worded to get some clues about that sort of thing. Annotating is something to do. Now, we can't do this directly on the page unless you are one of the rare test takers who is taking it on paper. But there are still ways you can annotate on your scratch paper and sort of construct a working outline of the passage as you go. So 3 to 5 word summaries per paragraph. The idea there is it's not going to take you too long to write it down, but you still have enough words where you can write down something that makes sense. You're not just writing down a intro or something like that. You want to say something a little bit more specific. And again, we'll look at some specific examples of how to do that as we go. And then in addition to the main idea, any important supporting claims or key consequences, implications that come up, you might make a note of. And then finally, simplifying as needed. So we talk about reading actively. Well, again, we can't do this directly on the page, but when you have lengthy appositives, interruptions within the sentence, parenthetical remarks, or technical descriptions, you can bracket those out, at least mentally, the first time through, and try to extract the main point being made in the sentence. If you're struggling with the main point, you can think in terms of the functions that we looked at in the last video. In other words, is this background information? Is this a supporting point? Does this look like the main idea? That sort of thing. So simplifying, brushing some of the details to the side can help identifying those components. And then remember that you can always go back and reread if needed. So if there's some specific details that turn out to be really important, well, you can go and find those with the specific question in mind. And then finally, paying attention to transition words. And now what follows is not going to be completely 100% comprehensive, but this is going to be a fairly thorough look at some of the more common categories of transition words. So words that indicate that the author is about to provide an example. Well, for example, for instance, in particular, to wit. So all of these indicate that the author is going to clarify a previous point by providing an example or two. If the author is adding to a previous point, you might see a word like furthermore, moreover, in addition, as well as, also, likewise, to indicate contrast. We've got on the one hand, on the other hand, so those are generally used together, one sentence after the other. While, rather, instead, in contrast, but, however, alternatively, even so, all the same, nevertheless, nonetheless, yet, otherwise, that said. There are some differences between some of these words, but again, all of these indicate some sort of contrast. Restating for clarity, if the author says, in other words, that is, namely, stated differently, that means they're going to back up and offer a slightly different spin on what they've just said, perhaps simplifying it or reiterating it in some way that makes it easier to understand. If they're going to emphasize the previous point, they might say something like in fact or indeed to indicate the structure of a passage or argument, first, second, next, then, finally, to indicate a consequence or result of something that has previously been stated, therefore, thus, as a result, so, accordingly, hence, consequently, to indicate similarity in a comparison. We've got likewise, similarly, analogously, in the same way. Sometimes the author will make a point or mention a point, maybe some background information, and then try to sort of dismiss that or move on beyond it. At any rate, in any event, in any case, regardless, nevertheless, and you'll note that we've already seen nevertheless, but some of these words can be a little flexible in terms of how they're employed, to indicate a personal stance. In other words, a personal stance on the part of the author Fortunately and unfortunately, those tend to indicate an author's opinion. So-called, that tends to indicate a kind of dismissive tone, or at least a skeptical tone. Same thing with allegedly and purportedly. Happily and luckily are a lot like fortunately. If an author uses scare quotes around a word or phrase, a lot of times that's going to be used to indicate a sort of skepticism, if not outright dismissal. Now, not every use of scare quotes indicates that sort of attitude, but that's something that you can look for. If let's say they refer to the quote unquote solution to a problem, what that means is they likely don't consider it to really be a solution. It's more like a purported solution. So again, those kinds of things can indicate a personal stance, and in turn, that can tell us something about the author's opinion. A few more categories of transition words and phrases. So to indicate caution or uncertainty, to indicate to the reader that some caution is needed in terms of interpreting maybe a previous claim or some evidence that the author has presented. Apparently, at least, could, may, might, perhaps, possibly, likely, seemingly. So we could contrast all of these words with words such as definitely or must or indisputable, that sort of thing. So these kind of words indicate, again, an air of caution on the part of the writer. If the author is generalizing, perhaps zooming out to make a broader point, they might use a word such as generally or on the whole, by and large, all in all, in general, broadly speaking. And to summarize, they might use phrases such as in conclusion, in short, in brief, overall, ultimately. Now, you do not need to go back and memorize these lists. The idea is that these words or phrases serve as important signals to pay attention to as you're navigating your way through the passages. Now let's look at a sample passage and apply some of these ideas to it. Geese can often be seen grazing in coastal salt marshes. Now, that's certainly not an opinion. That's not a conclusion, not a main idea. Rather, it's some background information about geese. Now we see one of these opinion words. Unfortunately, their intense grazing removes the grassy covering, exposing marsh sediment. This increases evaporation, which in turn increases salt concentration in marsh sediments. So what we see here basically is a statement of a problem. The author is saying, here is a problem. Here is a problem that has to do with geese's behavior and maybe its effects on the environment, the ecosystem. And then we have a supporting point that's indicating some cause and effect relationship here. Their intense grazing exposes marsh sediment, and then that in turn increases evaporation, and that in turn increases salt concentration in marsh sediments. We notice already that that's the kind of thing that could require a detailed flow chart to follow. So again, we don't want to read a sentence like this and say, I've got to go back and reread that again, and then start worrying about whether or not you understood all of it. We just want to be keeping in mind the main function of these sentences as we work our way through the passage and try to identify the main idea. Okay, because of this increased concentration, regrowth of plants is minimal, leading to increased erosion, which leads to a decrease in the fertile topsoil, leading to even less regrowth. So we have more supporting details or supporting points here, continuing this chain of cause and effect from the previous sentence. This process challenges one of the most widely held beliefs about the dynamics of salt marsh ecosystems. And so here we see some of these important signal words. It challenges widely held beliefs. So you see a word like that, and that's a good sign that you are getting close to the main idea, or that you're on your way to identifying the purpose of the passage. So again, it's challenging a common belief, a widely held belief, one of the more common types of main ideas or purposes that we encounter on the GRE reading section. And then finally, the last sentence says, rather, the standard view claims marshes are controlled by bottom-up factors such as nutrients and physical factors. So concludes here with some background, specifically background about the common belief that's being challenged. So what we notice here, if you think about what we saw in the last video with some of the sample passages that we looked at in talking about the anatomy of a GRE reading passage, they're not formulaic in the sense that the last sentence is always going to give you the main idea, or the last sentence is always going to do this, or always going to do that. And so it's not so much the position of the sentence that matters, it's going to be these signal words that tell us, aha, here is likely the main idea. Here is a contrasting point. Here is an opinion by the author. Here is a series of cause and effect relationships that supports some previous point. So having done all that, we get to our main idea, or we scribble down our main idea. Geese affect the ecosystem, and that challenges conventional wisdom regarding marshes. So again, the conventional wisdom is that they are controlled by bottom-up factors, such as nutrients and physical factors, whereas this passage is suggesting, no, it's top-down in the sense of the geese are actively affecting the ecosystem that they inhabit or that they are a key component in. Another way that we can look at this passage in terms of the key ideas, again, looking at some of these transition words, and those are in yellow here. So unfortunately, in turn, because of this, in time, supposedly, rather. And then again, we've got challenges and widely held beliefs. So those indicate that the main idea is looming, so it challenges widely held beliefs. So that'll do it for this video. In the next video, we'll apply these ideas to one long passage in particular and go through that and start looking at some of the question types as well.